scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should. We must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
We've signed a climate convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets. Were included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document and the Rio Declaration. Let me be clear on one fundamental point. The United States fully intends to be the world's preeminent leader in protecting the global environment.
Coming up, Technocracy News. And greetings from Technocracy News and Trends. Patrick Wood here, Editor-in-Chief. And today we're going to take a look at Europe again because France has risen to the top of the headline structure here. They have launched a nationwide facial recognition ID program. We just had an article the other day that noted that Europe is already a technocracy, and that was the plan from the beginning. And in those early days, it was members of the Trilateral Commission who put together the concept of the EU. It was in the same year that the Rio de Janeiro conference was held to create the doctrine of sustainable development, Agenda 21. That was the year that the EU actually got kicked off. It was the same people with the same policy promoting technocracy. Few people recognized it back then, but people in Europe have been talking about it now for some time, as you know. People in America are not talking about it. Their head is still stuck in the sand on this. They're chasing the demons of Marxism, the demons of communism and socialism. And yes, those things are real, but as we've discussed before in the pages of Technocracy News and Trends, those things are merely the useful idiots of technocracy. So France is launching a nationwide facial recognition ID program, a national ID system, and although they say it's voluntary at this point, it will not be at some point, but they're following in the footsteps of Technocracy China. China has been leading the way on facial recognition technology and on the social credit scoring system that they have made rather infamous in the world today. Over 75 countries have adopted this type of technology. France is the latest. We'll see how this turns out for the people of France. But the article states, France is poised to become the first European country to use facial recognition technology to give citizens a secure digital identity, whether they want it or not. Saying it wants to make the state more efficient, there's that word efficient, by the way, that's a sure sign that technocrats are close by. President Emmanuel Macron's government is pushing through plans to roll out an ID program dubbed ALICEM, A-L-I-C-E-M, in November, earlier than the initial Christmas target. The country's data regulator says the program breaches the European rule of consent, and a privacy group is challenging it in France's highest administrative court. It took a hacker just over 1 hour to break into a secure government messaging app this year, raising concerns about the state security standards. None of that, however, is deterring the French Interior Ministry. The government wants to funnel people to use ALICEM and facial recognition, said Martin Drago, a lawyer member of the privacy group, filed a suit against the state. We're heading into mass usage of facial recognition. There's little interest in the importance of consent and choice. The case filed in July won't suspend ALICEM. With the move, France will join states around the world rushing to create digital identities to give citizens secure access to everything from their taxes and banks to Social Security and utility bills. Singapore uses facial recognition and has signed an accord to help the UK prepare its own ID system. India uses iris scans. France said the ID system won't be used to keep tabs on residents. Unlike China and Singapore, the country won't be integrating the facial recognition biometric into citizens' identity databases. In fact, the Interior Ministry, which developed the ALICEM app, says the facial recognition data collected will be deleted when the enrollment process is over. That hasn't stopped people from worrying about its potential misuse. Rushing into facial recognition at this point is a major risk because of uncertainties on its final use, said one governing party lawmaker who sits on the Parliament's Future Technologies Commission and is the author of a July report on the subject. Allowing mass usage before putting in place proper checks and balances is ludicrous, he said. Well, this article goes on, and as usual, the state promises that this will not be used to track citizens, and yet they're tracking citizens. Well, Brazil and its newly elected president, President Jair Bolsonaro, is back in the news again. And green fascists all over the world are mounting a campaign to charge Bolsonaro with ecocide over the Amazon fires. Ecocide. This might be a term you haven't heard of yet, but listen to my comments. Green fascist radicals have the ears and pages of mainstream media, like the New York Times, and by the way, this article did appear in New York Times, to openly demonize a duly elected president of a sovereign nation in order to bully, intimidate, slander, and generally promote their insane causes. This is the epitome of the worst sort of hate speech and fake news, but it's of no concern to major media outlets. Ecocide is defined as, quote, the extensive destruction, damage, or loss of ecosystems of a given territory, whether by human agency or other causes, to such an extent that peaceful enjoyment by the inhabitants of that territory has been severely diminished, close quote. Americans and Brazilians need to understand that these forces of green fascism, aka technocracy and sustainable development, will not be silenced unless they are completely rejected by citizens everywhere. If the control freaks were ever to rise to power, their jackboot would stamp out freedom and liberty everywhere. The article states, since August, as vast stretches of the Amazon rainforest were being reduced to ashes and outrage and calls for action intensified, a group of lawyers and activists who have been advancing a radical idea have seen a silver lining in the unfolding tragedy. One day, a few years from now, they imagined Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, being hauled to The Hague to stand trial for ecocide, a term broadly understood to mean the willful and widespread destruction of the environment, and one that, they hope, will eventually be on par with other crimes against humanity. Now remember, this is the New York Times floating this article. They are 100% in agreement with the green fascists who are charging ecocide. It continues, there is no international crime today that can be used to neatly hold world leaders or corporate chief executives criminally responsible in peacetime for ecological catastrophes that result in the type of mass displacements and population wipeouts more commonly associated with war crimes. But environmentalists say the world should treat ecocide as a crime against humanity, like genocide, now that the imminent and long-term threats posed by a warming planet are coming into sharper focus. And Mr. Bolsonaro, they have come to see something of an ideal villain, tailor-made for a legal test case. Quote, he has become a poster boy for the need for a crime of ecocide, said Jojo Mehta, the co-founder of Stop Ecocide, a group that is seeking to give the International Criminal Court in The Hague the jurisdiction to prosecute leaders and businesses that knowingly cause widespread environmental damage. It's awful, but at the same time, it's timely, he said. The first prominent call to outlaw ecocide was made in 1972 by Prime Minister Olof Palme of Sweden, who hosted the UN's first major summit on the environment. In his keynote address at the conference, Mr. Palme argued that the world urgently needed a unified approach to safeguarding the environment. The air we breathe is not the property of any one nation. We share it, he said. The big oceans are not divided by national frontiers. They are our common property. That idea got little traction at the time, and Mr. Palme died in 1986, having made little headway in his quest to establish binding principles to protect the environment. During the 80s and 90s, diplomats considered including ecocide as a grave crime as they debated the authorities of the International Criminal Court, which is primarily established to prosecute war crimes. But when the court's founding document, known as the Rome Statute, went into force in 2002, language that would have criminalized large-scale environmental destruction had been stripped out at the insistence of major oil-producing nations. In 2016, the court's top prosecutor signaled an interest in prioritizing cases within its jurisdiction that featured the destruction of the environment, the illegal exploitation of natural resources, or the illegal dispossession of land. That move came as activists seeking to criminalize ecocide had been laying the groundwork for a landmark change to the court's remit. Their plan is to get a state that is party to the Rome Statute, or a coalition of them, to propose an amendment to its charter establishing ecocide as a crime against peace. At least 2/3 of the countries that are signatories to the Rome Statutes would have to back the initiative to outlaw ecocide for the court to get an expanded mandate. And even then, it would only apply to countries that accept the amendment. Still, it could change the way the world thinks about environmental destruction. Richard Rogers, a lawyer who specializes in international criminal law and human rights, said that if ecocide campaigners in countries suffering the effects of climate change put forward a narrow definition of the crime, it could quickly garner widespread support. He said, "We've seen in the past few years a huge shift in public opinion, and we're entering a phase where there is going to be a huge pressure on governments to do more. Given the number of countries and businesses that would recoil at the prospect of being held criminally responsible for environmental damage," he said, "it is vital to come up with the criteria that preserve prosecution for cases in which massive and systematic environmental destruction is done knowingly or intentionally." Environmental activists say there is no shortage of culprits who could be put on trial if the world were to decide to outlaw ecocide. From an evidentiary standpoint, Mr. Bolsonaro is an attractive potential defendant because he has been so starkly disdainful of his own country's environmental laws and regulations. He vowed to put an end to fines issued by the agency that enforces environmental laws. He has asserted that protecting the environment matters only to vegans. He complains that Brazil's 1988 constitution set aside too much land to indigenous communities who don't speak our language. Since Mr. Bolsonaro took office in January, deforestation in the Amazon has increased significantly, setting the stage for thousands of fires that began raging last month. Government agencies tasked with protecting the environment warn, meanwhile, that they are at a breaking point as a result of budget and personal cuts. Mr. Bolsonaro is by no means the only world leader reviled by environmentalists. President Trump has been assailed for rolling back environmental regulations and pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. This article continues. It's a hit piece on all populist movement leaders like President Bolsonaro of Brazil, like President Donald Trump of America, and other leaders around the world. This campaign of bullying, intimidating, and slandering will not go away unless citizens everywhere stand up and reject this nonsense once and for all. It has to be the people of the world that say we will not put up with this anymore. The last story is of great significance. My headline for it is Central Bankers Plan for Master Reset into the Green Economy. The idea of a master reset of the global economy has been around for some time. We've talked about it in the pages of Technocracy News and Trends. I've spoken about it in presentations that I've given around the country over the last 3 or 4 years. And this is not a secret that the global elite is pushing for a global reset of the economic system. There are a number of reasons for this. A couple are that technocracy in the end requires the destruction of capitalism and free enterprise in order to bring in the new economic system of sustainable development, aka technocracy warmed over from the 1930s. It's a resource-based economic system that basically will put all of the world's resources into a common global trust, managed by the global elite, of course, to dole out resources to those who are deemed worthy to process them into goods and services to sell them to consumers around the world. Secondly, we see that the monetary system has run its course. With the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the plan indeed was to use inflation to chisel off a small amount of the wealth of nations until the currency ultimately would be completely debased. We've reached that point where paper currencies around the world literally are seen as worthless. They're still used for trade, they're still necessary for trade, but the value of debt-backed currency has run out of steam. There's nowhere for it to go. A large portion of the world's bonds now are trading at a negative interest rate. That works the other way for them. They can't make any money on that. So generally speaking, the currencies of the world are seen to have run their course, and they're ready for a master reset. Well, those two ideas combine in this story as the Bank of England leads the world's central banks into a Green New Deal. It proposes green bonds now as a way to finance sustainable development, aka technocracy, and plunder the world's wealth once and for all. This is really a huge story. Central banks, by and large, have been sitting back and watching the parade go by. I've written several times that central banks are the ones that are complicit with bringing to us the world of sustainable development and technocracy. Their fingerprints and footprints are seen going way back, even to the early 1970s, where they began to establish the doctrines of sustainable development. But today, the color green is beginning to show through clearly concerning central banks around the world. And it will be inconceivable to most people that the central banking system, including the United States Federal Reserve System, is now going green. And they're promoting and supporting the Green New Deal. Well, how much of this did AOC know when she began to suggest political action to establish the Green New Deal in America? The only companies that are making money off this are those giant global corporations who are promoting Green New Deal technology throughout the world for programs and for systems that are not proven, that have never been demonstrated to work correctly in society, that provide no protection for intrusion, no protection against complete digital control. None of these things have ever been proven and tested, and yet the central banking system now is showing its colors, its true colors, by jumping on the bandwagon, getting behind it. This story, written by Matthew Arrett of Strategic Culture, starts out and says, I was told many depressing things as a child, watching World Vision infomercials educating the West to the want and misery suffered by millions of children in the third world. I wasn't alone in asking adults, why? When I enjoyed all the comforts of food security, electricity, and running water, why were these other children living in poverty? I know I was not the only bewildered child to receive the shallow response that I did from family and teachers when I was told that this, quote, simply is the way it is. At best, we privileged few in the first world could hope that $1 a day would alleviate their pain, but really there was no great solution. Later in life, as my closest friends found themselves enmeshed in university political science and economics programs, the innocent curiosity that recognized injustice for what it was not only died under the weight of materialist theories of human nature, which their parents paid good money to feed them, but upon leaving school, those same friends actually became witting accomplices in that very system which their youthful hearts recognized as wrong so many years earlier. Since humanity was intrinsically selfish and our economic system so immutable, the best we could hope for was success in life and enjoy being on the receiving end of destiny. Again, I know I'm not alone in this experience, as tens of millions of citizens took to the streets all around the world on September 27 to march for the earth, repulsed by corrupt consumerism and celebrating the advent of a Green New Deal. This activation of people power, driven by such institutions as the Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for the Future, and the young Greta Thunberg, could never have occurred had not a deep sense of injustice and malaise not already been festering in our collective hearts. That sense of injustice and malaise connects us to our deepest humanity and is a purity which unites each of us in a field of compassion with the whole of which we are but parts, and should be celebrated and protected at all cost. In spite of that purity, something much darker showed its ugly face on September 27, which used that inherent goodness to its dark advantage. It is that dark something that I would like to discuss. You know something isn't right when ... The first clue as to the ugly problem can be found in the simple fact that leading central bankers have already issued a call for the same new green banking system which Greta and countless masses also demanded long before Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for the Future, or There Is No Time were ever created. While officially announced on September 22nd at the opening of the UN Climate Summit in New York, a Bankers' Central Climate Compact was unveiled under the leadership of the Bank of England Governor Mark Carney that had already been in the works for over 18 months, representing over 130 of the world's largest and corrupt banks, calling for a radical decarbonization of the world economy by 2/3 according to commitments laid out in the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. Bank of England Chair and Chair of the Bank of International Settlements Financial Stability Board, Mark Carney, announced at this venture that, quote, climate disclosures must become comprehensive, climate risk management must be transformed, and sustainable investing must go mainstream, close quote. Carney then took a more threatening tone by saying, quote, the firms that anticipate these developments will be rewarded handsomely. Those that don't will cease to exist. Now, how's that for a threat, by the way? The article continues, now Mark Carney has been hailed by the environmental lobby as the leading eco-warrior of central bankers, and those doing the hailing seem to rarely take notice of the blatant fact that the person who sits atop the technocratic power structure that has given rise to the world's greatest economic and environmental injustices for decades is also the person designing how this dysfunctional world is supposed to be restructured. So how do Carney and his fellow hive of central bankers propose the world transform? For starters, Carney believes that a new global reserve currency must replace the U.S. dollar. What should this post-dollar system be based upon? Well, as of August 23rd, during a central bankers summit in Jackson Hole, Carney stated that it would be modeled on Facebook's cryptocurrency, the Libra, which is scheduled to start issuance by early next year. Unlike the Libra, however, Carney's cryptocurrency will be entirely controlled by private banking institutions and totally removed from sovereign nation states, which are just too influenced by short-term political interests rather than an enlightened technocratic elite who know how to truly think long-term. Knowing that China's Belt and Road Initiative is increasingly becoming the foundation for a viable new economic order, and knowing that the financial oligarchy's monopoly over the world finance will come undone if that were so, Carney also warned that a crypto-digital currency is the only way to stop the renminbi from becoming the U.S. dollar's replacement. Carney called his digital solution to be a, quote, synthetic hegemonic currency through a network of central bank digital currencies, close quote, which would base their value upon new standards not existent in the 1971 to the 2019 globalized model. And of course, what happened in 1971 that this should be the defining period of time that the globalized model has been operating in? Well, of course, that was the era that gold was decoupled from the dollar by President Richard Nixon. The article continues, according to the Green New Deal proposed by Carney and his allies, in order to bring the world carbon dioxide production down to net zero emissions by 2050, as demanded by COP21, several things must happen. Number one, green bonds must be expanded en masse in the similar fashion that victory bonds were created in World War II to pay for the growth of industry needed to battle Hitler. Number two, in reducing industrial growth through the transition from a carbon-based society towards a green energy-fueled society of windmills and solar panels, carbon footprints must be diminished. Number three, carbon taxes and cap-and-trade mechanisms must become hegemonic, which then creates measurable values for the reduction of humanity's carbon footprint. And my friends, this is pure, unadulterated technocracy from the 1930s. morphed into sustainable development in the 1990s and presented to us today as the Green New Deal. I recommend this article to be read by all listeners to this broadcast because it's extremely important to understand now that the world banking system is showing its true colors by jumping on board to the Green New Deal. They will control the narrative. They will attempt to control the outcome. Only people of the world, the citizens who will suffer the most, can rise up and say no to this program and reject it altogether. It has not happened yet, but you can see the handwriting is clearly on the wall, and these people intend to completely change the economic system in the world to a Green New Deal. I'm Patrick Wood for Technocracy News and Trends. We'll see you next time.